Hey, welcome back to the garage workshop, where I just finished up constructing the hull of the new kayak. Since it would make a pretty ugly half boat right now, the next steps are to clean up the hull and prep it for fiberglass. Sounds quick, huh? Well, compared to the time it took to add strips to the hull, yes, but there's still a lot of work to be done. First thing is to remove the wire nails that were holding the shear strips in place. These would just get in the way of sanding later. Next is to clean off any random high spots and glue squeeze outs using a paint scraper. I was pretty careful with the glue application this time around, so thankfully there weren't too many excessive gluing penalties. After the hull was scraped somewhat clean, I had to shape the bow. When adding the wood strips, I purposely left the bow long and rough so I could come back and clean it later. Well, it's later, and I needed to trim some parts and add some more material so I could get the bow to the approximate shape I wanted. Since I wasn't using bead and cove joinery on the wood strips, inevitably there would be a few small holes to patch before I can proceed with sanding the hull. Not a problem. I marked with tape where the holes in the hull were, and then made up a putty of wood flour mixed with glue. Spread the putty into the gaps and let it dry. Now we're ready to start sanding. Well, almost. Sanding is a horribly messy, dusty, dirty process, so to reduce the particulates that could cover every square millimeter of stuff in the garage, I built a Dexter-style tent from a few sheets of plastic painter's drop cloth. With the garage door open and a couple fans blowing, this should keep the rest of the space relatively dust-free. With the Dexter tent all set up, sandpaper required, it was time to begin. Starting with changing into the appropriate sanding PPE. I'm not sure exactly how harmful paulownia dust is to the lungs, but I'm not really wanting to find out either. One thing I love about working with paulownia is that it sands really well, so there's no need to go any coarser than 80 grit with the sandpaper, well, unless you really want to remove a lot of material. So the first round of sanding is with 80 grit paper on the random orbital sander. The random orbital has the potential to remove a lot of material if left in one spot for too long, so I made sure to evenly apply pressure and keep the sander moving across the hull, both up and down and along the length of the kayak. After finishing a first pass with the random orbital sander, I put some 80 grit paper on the sanding board and did another round by hand, making sure to take long strokes to really start ferrying out the hull. Since the bow and bow keel are pretty sharp, I had to sand most of this part by hand. Then once finished, it was time to repeat the whole process, but going up to 120 grit with the sandpaper. Just like the bow, the hard chine on the stern had to be sanded by hand. With a kayak, you want to make sure that you have as smooth of an outside surface as you can possibly get, and achieving that starts now. Before the next sanding round, I used a spray bottle to wet down the raw wood and raise the grain. This part's actually really fun, since the color of the paulownia darkens a little and pops when it's slightly wet. After the hull dried out with the raised grain, it was time to go back to a couple rounds of sanding at 120 grit. First with the random orbital sander, and then again by hand with the sanding board. I'm not going to go any higher than 120 grit before adding fiberglass. This will leave some good surface area for the epoxy to bond to. Plus, if I can get the boat as fair as I want now, I can sand with finer grits after the boat is wrapped in fiberglass and some thicker epoxy fill coats are built up. I also have another plan in mind prior to fiberglassing anyway. I painted the first Chimera as a finish, and even though it looks great, I wanted the second to have more of a wood look. But not pure wood, some sort of unique color pattern. I decided to stain the wood in a random geometric pattern before glassing. I taped off a polygonal pattern on the hull and prepped for two colors, and a strip of bare wood will show between each stained polygon after I remove the tape. To make sure this would actually work, I made up and fiberglassed a test panel. Well, actually two, but for the first one I used a different brand of stain and the epoxy didn't adhere that well to the wood. I'm going with an alcohol-based stain, Mohawk or Bellin Solar Lux Penetrating Non-Grain Raising Stain, as recommended by Nick Schotte, in jet black and oxblood red. Application is pretty easy. Slop some onto a white rag, and then rub the stain into the wood. The stain soaks in quite well. Biggest thing to watch for is not getting too messy as you're throwing the stain and rag around. After the black stain was slathered across the hull, I went back over the stain with some denatured alcohol to smooth out the coloring. And with the black polygons finished, I repeated the same process with the red stain. With the stain applied and all smoothed out, the final step was some good tape removal ASMR. Now the outside of the hull is ready for the next phase, getting wrapped in fiberglass and epoxy. But we'll save that for the next video. Until then, thanks for watching.